I'm a god.
Well, what if there is no tomorrow?
I'm a god.
There wasn't one today.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's Time to Rewind, a podcast stuck in its own time loop right along with the movies we discuss. And this season, we're taking a look at Groundhog Day, after day, after day, after day. I'm your host, Bubbawheat from Flights, Tights, and Movie Nights, and in this episode, we're discussing Phil's 28th Groundhog Day that starts at 66 minutes and 8 seconds with Phil declaring that he's a god, and ends at 74 minutes and 55 seconds with Rita asking Phil if he said something, then they both say goodnight to each other. Today, my guest is Robert Black from the Groundhog Day Project, as well as Annihilation Minute. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great.
Well, I'm really glad that you agreed to come on here because for people that don't know, the Groundhog Day Project, why don't you go ahead and tell everybody a little bit about your Groundhog Day Project?
Yeah, the Groundhog Day Project was a blog that the first year was 365 days of me watching the movie Groundhog Day and writing basically about whatever kind of came up. And that got me obsessed with time loops. I watched other time loop movies and TV episodes. And then I continued the blog for another 3 years worth of entries with still going back to Groundhog Day at least once a month. And so, yeah, I've watched this movie somewhere over 450 times. I don't know the exact number because I don't know how many times I'd watched it between 93 and the beginning of my blog.
That is pretty crazy. I mean, I know that this minute-by-minute format involves breaking it down and watching a movie many, many times. Like, I've watched each loop many, many times so far, but I don't think I've even hit, well over 100 doing it this way, and that just kind of blows my mind. I mean, what was it about Groundhog Day that made you choose that movie?
Well, it was a couple things. A guy had done a blog a year or two before that, I think it was, called Lawrence and Julia, where he, on a whim, he was a college student one night, turned on Julia and Julia and then wrote about it, and then he kept doing it. And it got really bizarre because he didn't like the movie. But then he kind of did the more he watched it and the more he watched it. And it got covered in Entertainment Weekly even. And I'm like, that's not a good movie for that format. And my immediate impulse was Groundhog Day would be great for that because it's like that repetition of doing it over and over. And right before my blog started on August 2nd, so it was 6 months before the holiday. A week before that, there was a screening of Groundhog Day in Old Town Pasadena, not far from where I live, like where they projected up on a wall over this courtyard and you could sit there and watch it. And I'm sitting there during the movie thinking, I could totally break this down and just go over and over and talk about this and I'm thinking of things I could do with it. And the next morning, I registered groundhogdayproject.com. I opened up the blogger and set up a thing for it because I already had an account there and was preparing all this stuff. And a week later, I started it.
That's pretty impressive to start that and then stick with it. But
yeah. I didn't even necessarily know I'd go for a year when I started, but it was almost immediate that I was like, yeah, I'm going to do this. I was like, I could finish on the holiday and it'd be 6 months. That's fine. And then before I got anywhere near that, I was determined to do the whole year. And then by the end of the year, I'd wanted to keep writing.
And then if you could pick out something, like, what would you say is like the most surprising thing that you learned about the movie through this project?
That's actually hard to answer because the best thing about it is even after that first year, almost every time I'd watch it, I'd notice something new. And sometimes it'd be minor stuff. Like for a long time, I didn't realize there's a piano at the bed and breakfast. And then I saw it one day. I'm like, oh, so he has somewhere he could practice. Okay, fine. And it just put a whole nother level to like how long he might have been in there or how long he might not have, because I usually go very minimum on day count. And it's things like that, or the way characters interact with each other, especially once I had different copies of the script or different drafts of the script. Most of the characters have names and you don't know it. Like even the three old ladies are Ruby, Sarah, and Gertie. Like Mrs. Lancaster's first name is Florence. His date at the movie theater is named Lorraine. Like, they all have names. And I love that because in a script where it doesn't sometimes I complain about that. Another podcast I did, Mandy Sucks Minute, I complained constantly that none of the characters had names because in the credits they have names. I'm like, no one ever said those. They don't count. But in this one, it was like this extra little thing that made it fun.
And I think that actually is a perfect jumping point into today's loop, because that was one of the things that I was going to bring up, especially about this, because he's at the Tip Top Cafe and he has the moment where he's talking to all the various people that, like the waitresses and some of the patrons, and a couple of them that we had seen but earlier in the movie, but then other ones we hadn't. And I feel like that's a really important moment, that like a movie moment that does show that this film isn't just populated with background set dressing as people for the extras, but each of these people here have a name, they have a story.
And in this particular scene, a lot of these extras have also been seen in other scenes. Like even the old man at the booth behind him when he sits down with Rita at the end of this segment in the cafe, that old man's out at Gobbler's Knob. One of my least favorite background characters in the movie, credited as the Bachelor on IMDb, is also in the scene. He's over waiting to get a table, and I always got annoyed with him because he dances in front of the camera several times at the banquet at the end. You have these characters, not just ones we know already or ones we will know later, but ones that, especially from my way of looking at it, seeing it over and over, I'm like, oh, I've seen that guy before. He was there when he was ice sculpting, and I like recognize different people. That I wish I could identify some of those people that aren't like don't have lines, because I went to Woodstock and like I could have tried to meet some of them or something. But
I kind of wish that I had started this podcast sooner, because I used to live, just earlier this year, just a few towns away from Woodstock in the Chicago suburbs. And my first guest was someone who, he lived also in the Chicago suburbs, and his wife's family actually does live in Woodstock. So he spent a lot of time there, including when this movie was filmed.
Nice.
But yeah, I didn't, start digging into this until I moved to the Atlanta area, which I feel was kind of a missed opportunity. Like I visited Woodstock once, but I've never really visited it with this movie in mind.
Right.
And yeah, I didn't look into, the actors playing the diner patrons very much. But I think it's always worth mentioning, and I think most people usually do mention the two names that are two actors that have gone on to become bigger stars, and that's of course the couple that just got engaged, Debbie and Fred.
Yeah.
And they're played by Hendon Walsh and Michael Shannon, who they both actually tie into my other blog very well, because they both are, I think, best known for their superhero roles. Michael Shannon played General Zod in The Man of Steel, and then Hendon Walsh, I think one of her best known voices is Starfire from Teen Titans.
Ah, yeah.
And she's also done plenty of other voiceover work. But this is one of her handful of live action roles that she did. One other thing that I think is interesting then in terms of Phil getting to know these extras is that it's a bit of a one-sided intimacy.
Yes.
Because he's able to take the time to learn everything that he wants to about all of these people.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't really know anything about him. They might on the day, but then the next day that all just goes away.
Well, that's a time loop thing always. You'll get that in every one of the things you'll watch for the show. Is there's it's always mismatch, and it's why there's always, well, no, I shouldn't say always. Usually that adolescent phase where they play around with it, like him picking up Nancy, is because they have information that other people don't have or don't know they have. and they can use that. And then at this point, he's not using it. He's trying to impress Rita, or not impress, but trying to convince Rita.
Right.
And so it's useful, but he's not doing it at the expense of these characters.
There's always a lot of repetition in time loop movies, of course. And I think that this has a few interesting, moments of not just repetition, but also like mirroring, because this is the fourth time that we visited the Tip Top Cafe in this film. And do you know what happened the first time that he visited the Tip Top Cafe?
Well, the first time is when he got too much food, right?
Actually, it was before that. It was when he told Rita.
Oh, when he
that
just didn't want
was
to do the recording, yeah.
Yeah, and he told Rita that, he's done this before. He tried to convince her then, back in like day 3 or 4, that he is living a time loop. But in that instance, she just told him that he needs to go get his head checked, which he immediately does.
Mm-hmm.
And this time it plays out differently, even though it's...
Oh, a lot. Well, and as we get to the end of this day as well, you get the second of 3 times, not counting the slap montage, that Rita is in his room.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of it's a little uneven time-wise, but I kind of think those are almost the ends of the 3 acts of the film, is when she's in his room, and how that goes tells you how the story is progressing.
He, during the first time, whenever he was trying to go through the first date, I feel like that the information that he was getting from Rita was very surface level. It was like things that she likes, things that he thought that he could use to get her on a more intimate level physically.
Yeah.
But I feel like most of the things that he mentions this time of things that he's learned about her are on a more deeper personal level.
Yes, definitely. And they're deeper. Yeah.
Yeah, they represent him getting to know her on a more personal level rather than just the surface level. And I think that really represents the beginning of a change in him personally.
Yeah, and he's not trying to get her to his bed. That's where she ends up, but that's not what he's going for here, and that makes it better.
Yeah, and he's very self-deprecating as well, because the first time around he was very narcissistic. Like everything that he mentioned about himself was to build himself up.
Yeah.
But now, like, he says that he's not that smart, and
Mm-hmm.
he mentions that he was a jerk.
Yep. Well, which I think him calling himself a jerk and her saying no is a turning point in his story as well, because she's now spent more time with Time Loop Phil than she may have ever spent with Phil.
Yeah, and that brings up something that I was kind of curious about, especially to get your perspective.
Yeah.
Do you think that Phil and Rita first met on February 1st, or do you think that she worked in the studio before? They just never directly worked together?
I think the movie suggests she's new, but you're not sending a producer out into the field. Well, she could have worked at a different station, I suppose. I've read other versions, like even the original version of the script. She's not the new one. She's like an old producer, and it's a different dynamic between the two of them. And now I think the idea is, yes, she's new, but I don't get the impression that she doesn't work there. Like he knows, I want to say Kevin, but that's not it.
Yeah, I went back and refreshed myself with him first meeting, and he does. I don't remember his replacement weatherman name either.
Right, but he's also saying like she's a really good producer, and like he could have heard that from like she got hired from some other station, like maybe she's new to the Pittsburgh station, but I never thought so. I always thought it was like she's been working at this station. This is her first time working with Phil.
Yeah,
So he
I
had
got
seen her
that.
before, but maybe they hadn't interacted.
Yeah, he says he does specifically mention that Phil hasn't worked with her yet,
Yeah.
but Phil also knew that she was fun, so he knew about her, and I think watching this made me think that she isn't brand new to the station, that she has worked in the station. She just didn't work directly with Phil. She had worked like in a different department, and then
Yeah.
this is her being promoted to
Well,
producer.
like she didn't work on the morning show before or
Right.
something. Yeah.
And also, whenever he says that you want to be a producer, but not just for Channel 8. And she's like, well, everybody knows that.
Yeah.
And I read that line as like everybody in the station knows that about her,
Mm-hmm.
which I think
Yeah.
that really shows that she has worked at the station a while enough for that, so that everybody there knows that
Which,
about her
which
already.
could be why she's now working on the morning show and going out as a field producer, is she took on this new part of the job because she's ambitious and wants to go farther.
Mhm.
Whereas he has a different kind of ambition. He thinks he's better than his job, but it doesn't seem like he's making much effort to do better.
And also, whenever he's talking, whenever they're talking in bed and he's talking to her while she's falling asleep, and he
Yeah.
mentions that, he knew from the first moment that he saw her that he wanted to hold her forever. Which
Mm-hmm.
at this point in the movie, it's like a very sweet romantic line.
Yeah.
And again, putting that into context, that's at least my theory here, that she has worked at the studio. I feel like that fits with my theory to where, he first saw her in the studio, like, maybe several months ago.
Maybe, yeah.
And
Although that first time he sees her in the movie is really nice, though. Her being all silly in front of the blue screen, like it's that newness of her is really evident there, and it would draw his attention. So,
what I don't like about that, though, is because he's so immediately dismissive of her in that
mhm,
moment. And I kind of like to think that, maybe he noticed her a few months ago and
maybe.
he had that, she just like caught his eye. But then as he learned more about her, he thought, well, she's not she would never go out with me because she's she's too nice for me. But he's still like in the back of his mind, he was still attracted to her, but he had already dismissed the fact that she would never be with him.
Yeah. Which especially comes from Rita as we see her in the movie, because her character in like this original script is this gruff producer that's been around a bit, and then the other character she gets combined with, Tess, has also seems like she's seen some stuff. She's like very like street smart, a little world weary, and I think this sort of naive version is a more interesting character for us to see him going after. It's because it's both really obvious and it makes sense.
Yeah,
Like
this is a
it
Rita
could be
that's
bad, but
that
it works
yeah,
because
this
it's
is
what
a
he
Rita
needs.
that spent 12 years in Catholic school.
Yeah, but I mean, he needs someone who is, as he calls her, new. He needs someone who still looks at the world and gets excited by it,
Yeah.
because that's not him.
One other thing that I noticed is Phil is very, except for just a couple moments, he's very soft spoken in this day. Like
Yeah.
he's very matter of fact. And I'm curious, do you think that this is the first time that he's done this day, or if he's done this specific day multiple times already?
Huh. It's interesting because his tone suggests he has settled down already and has kind of come to terms with what's going on, which
Mm,
doesn't feel like the day after he just killed himself. Because in the
right,
movie, this is right after we just saw his dead body.
right.
As I said, I usually go minimum on day count, but yeah, there's room here for a lot more tries at this. And I think Also, it doesn't have to be, and it sort of doesn't matter in a way because the tone is what matters.
Mhm.
And the fact that he's given up on dying. He's given up on trying to like get everything he can get out of this day. But he just wants someone to talk to about it.
Yeah, I feel like this is like a different type of rehearsed to where he's, like you said, he's accepted that what he's doing during the day is not going to make any difference. Like he knows that
Right.
he's going to wake up tomorrow, it's going to be reset, but he's still going to enjoy this day as many times as he can with this quiet resignation that it's still not going to change anything, and he's not excited by it anymore, but he's still enjoying it.
It's like, you'll get to it later, but it's like him at the dance. He has this tone where like he knows what's going to happen. It might go differently. It might not. It doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that he's enjoying it and he likes these people now and he likes Rita now, whether or not he did before. I think we can assume he's being honest about the first time he saw her because he says it while she's sleeping, and yet in film terms that feels like truth.
Right.
But also he's been mean to her along the way, and that's who he is. He belittles people when he wants to feel good about himself. Now he doesn't care about feeling good about himself.
Even though there is that one brief moment where his sarcastic humor still jumps out for a second whenever, and I think that this entire, like, 3 or 4 sentences in the conversation is an interesting back and forth. Whenever he's talking about, he says that he's killed himself so many times he shouldn't even
I don't even
exist
exist
anymore.
Yeah.
And then she's like, maybe this is a positive thing. And then he goes, gosh, you're such an upbeat lady. Like that, just that's basically old Phil peeking his head out, his head out to see his shadow, as it were.
Tonally, yes, but I think he means it.
Yeah, I do think
Like,
he means
and
it, but
he
it's also
sees something in it that he wants.
But
He
I
needs
think
that
it's
up.
also like him taking a slight dig at her because he's just like, I just told you something very vulnerable about me, about how I've been down so low that I've killed myself so many times, and you just completely ignore that fact and try to spin it in a positive way. So I think that there's just a little bit of like, really, you're just going to ignore that and just gloss over it.
Well, yeah, it's like when he got her to the tip top, I guess would be the third time, where she's like, "What? The world's ending tomorrow," and she just wants to know where to put the camera.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, maybe in a very unusual way, because what he just told her, that's huge. Like, yeah, the day repeats every day, and I know everything. Well, it could be okay. Like, it's both too big for her to understand, and I think she has a better understanding of it than a lot of the other characters would.
Yeah, and I can at least forgive her a little bit because jumping back to the beginning, he did start the conversation mentioning that he's been stabbed, shot, poisoned, frozen, hung, electrocuted, burned.
And burned.
And he mentions, and I thought that this was interesting and actually a little bit dark if you actually look into it, because she talks about, you survived a car wreck, and he's like, I didn't just survive a wreck, I wasn't blown up yesterday. Which that is one of only 2 specific references to things that we actually saw
That we've
in the
seen,
movie.
yeah.
But if you break that sentence apart, that implies that whenever the car crashed, it didn't blow up right away. So that means that he survived the initial crash enough to know that the car blew up afterwards.
Yeah. It's also nice phrasing because it's like I wasn't born yesterday is the reference. But that means that somehow he was, I don't mean to use this term, but it makes sense, born again when he blew up. He was then a different kind of version of Phil that kept wanting to die. And now he's in this scene, we're seeing him turn into something else. So he's sort of blowing up in a different way. by getting everyone's attention.
And I know that this has been mentioned in other places, but the various ways that he mentions that he's died, the majority of those, at least the way that he says them, they don't necessarily feel self-inflicted. But do you think that these are
That's
all...
correct, yeah.
Do you think that these are him just rephrasing self-inflicted wounds, or do you think that he's gotten in a situation where he's had other people inflict these deaths onto him?
It could be a little of both. I mean, the way he interacts with people, he could have pissed someone off enough that they shot him or or burned him. But also, he might think of the different versions of himself as different people. Like, it wasn't him who he is today that electrocuted him. It was him that day he got in the bathtub and didn't want to live. And it's like it's a whole other person other than who he is. And so it's sort of a distancing measure, maybe.
Yeah, and I can see that he doesn't feel like he's depressed Phil anymore. He's moved on to, or at least he's on the way towards acceptance Phil. If you go back to the 5 stages of grief,
right,
where he just spent a lot of time in depression, and then he's moving into acceptance here.
But then, since those 5 stages of grief don't always go in order, the rest of the movie is kind of him rebargaining who he is. Because now what does he do? He has a really good day here in this segment. He hangs out with Rita until after midnight. And then what's he going to do tomorrow? He can't just keep doing this. So he needs to find what now fulfills him when he got over all the fun stuff. And that's why this movie works and other time loops work, is because they often come to that same point, as this person who's kind of bad has to figure out how to be nice.
Right, or either that, or they have to figure out what's trapping them in the loop.
Well, yeah, when it's more of a science fiction angle, they gotta break the time loop. Fortunately, we didn't get that with this one.
Yeah, and I always appreciate that. And in general, I haven't really thought about this too much, but I think this is, especially so far, one of my top 2 or 3 days that he's experienced.
Yeah.
I do think that this one, I think this one and then the Groundhog car chase so far are my 2 favorites.
Nice. Like from your perspective, not
as a viewer.
Okay. I was thinking days he would enjoy most. I'm like, could be a few other ones in there. Going to the movie dressed as Clint Eastwood and in a fancy car, that's a pretty good day.
Yeah.
But yeah, as a viewer, no, this one, it kind of has to be one of your favorites, because this is sort of the point. This is where the movie becomes what it's going to be.
Yeah, and I mentioned this whenever I was talking with Sean and Phil's first date with Rita, that in terms of the time loop structure, it wasn't just about Phil trying to date Rita, but it was also about making the audience start to fall in love with Rita the way that Phil is.
Yeah.
And I think that section of the movie was about making the audience fall in love with Rita, and then this loop specifically is about making the audience fall in love with Phil and Rita's relationship.
Yeah, I mean, watching the movie over and over, there were times when I was annoyed with Rita. She can be really condescending and rude, like him, just without the sarcasm. And in this moment, you have to like her, The whole science experiment side of it works, and it makes it fun. And it is much better than them. I mean, I was going to say going to bed together, but they do go to bed together. They just sleep. And so it's better that way.
Yeah, and while they're laying in bed, he's flipping through the poems for every mood.
Yes.
And I don't often do a lot of deep research for this. Like most of my research is just watching the loop over and over, and I listen to the entirety of Groundhog Minutes, and I have browsed your blog here and there.
Yeah, there's
I
an entry
haven't
about this
done
book.
yeah, I haven't done a lot of deep diving just because it's a little hard to navigate because it is more of a free flowing blog, which
Yeah.
I appreciate that, and it makes sense, but it is hard to navigate as much for research purposes, unless like I'm looking for a specific thing.
Start at day 364. I believe it's that one, because there are recaps every 60 or so entries, and so they link to each other, the recaps, and then that'll tell you what each entry is about.
Yeah, I'll keep that in mind, even though I'm nearing the end here. But I might still
Like the
make
books
use
he's
of that.
reading when he's sitting at the counter later, and here's the music. I'll look
But
those up.
but I did do a little bit of research. I looked up poems for every mood
Hmm.
because it is an actual book of poetry from 1933, and it's a collection of basically a lot of famous poets from that time, all collected together. Like it's got James Joyce, it's got sonnets from William Shakespeare, and I did check it out through the internet's archive online library,
Nice.
and I glanced through it, and he does mention the only God can make a tree, which it absolutely is not
not in
in
it.
this book whatsoever. But I do think that there is some stuff in this book that's worth mentioning. And I almost like if I could do a rewrite, I feel like that the poem that he should have referenced, which is in the book, is Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening by Robert Frost.
Nice.
Because
Yeah.
and especially with the repetition, and I think that's one that a lot of people would know. But I love that the last two lines are, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep.
Hmm. I'm wondering if at some point that might have been the reference they were going to use, and the Frost estate wasn't as nice as the what's your name, Kilmer estate.
Yeah, Kilmer.
Because they have to reference this poem, even though the poem's not in the movie. They have to put it in the credits at the end, and so maybe they couldn't get permission, but that seems weird.
Yeah, I wouldn't think so. It should be in public domain, I would think.
It might not be, because Frost was famous while he was alive, so his family might have held on to it for a while. But I don't know. I don't like one other reason I found once where people thought the whole point of this reference to Only God Can Make a Tree is bringing God into the movie, and I don't think we need God in the movie
Yeah,
because it makes it too specific.
yeah, I don't think that's necessary either. Even though we do also like I mentioned earlier, Rita mentions that she spent 12 years in Catholic school.
Yes.
But a few other things that I did want to bring up that I noticed in the book, because we can see that he's fairly early. Like it looks like he might be in just the first few pages of the book.
Yeah.
And some of the first poems in there are actually lullabies. There's Golden Slumbers, Kiss Your Eyes by Thomas Dekker, Lullaby from the Princess by Alfred Lord Tennyson, and Lullaby by Leone Adams. And I thought that was interesting, that would be very appropriate poems to be reading.
In bed, yeah.
And then just a few pages later, one of the next poems is Nuptial by Laura Lee Bird. And then also, I think a lot of the chapters, I think, are very appropriate to this movie in general, not necessarily with this section specifically. I mean, some of them are, but there's chapters titled The Joy of Living, The Music of Humanity,
Hmm.
Magic and Enchantment, which that one is a little bit of a stretch with just the magic of the time loop in general. Art and beauty, memory and desire, which I think
Nice.
that one is very appropriate. Especially I've brought up several times that Phil has a very good memory because that's the only thing that he carries with him from day to day.
Yeah. And the movie establishes that right away
Mm.
because he recognizes the radio show and knows what they're going to say.
We just got out of the dark hours,
Mhm.
and earlier there was the comedy
it-
of love.
You're listing these parts and it makes me think two things at the same time. One, maybe this book is in the movie because it belonged to like Danny Rubin or Harold Ramis. Or two, maybe it's just that poetry collections with lots of different authors are going to try to be universal about like the human experience,
Mm.
like the movie is being. And so it's going to have a lot of those same parts because that's what you go through in life.
Yeah. And you go through love's tragedy, the triumph of love, the door of death, the life beyond life, which I like that one a lot too,
Nice.
especially within the context of this movie. And then the last chapter is peace.
Nice.
And I just like I love the poetry of those chapters and how
Mm-hmm.
well they tied into sections of the movie, and
Yeah.
I really wanted to point that out.
No, it's good. Yeah. It goes to like this, the thing I always liked about this movie is different religious groups will see this movie as representing them. Like a rabbi is like, this is a Jewish film because blah, blah, blah. Or this is a whatever. Like, and it's all true. Like they're all right
Yeah,
because you can see yourself in this story because the story, I was taking a film class during this blog when I was doing it was in the first year of the blog. And the teacher was like talking about classic Hollywood cinema and the way the story is always linear. And I mentioned Groundhog Day. And he's like, well, that's certainly not linear. I'm like, no, it's absolutely linear. It's just only linear for Phil.
yeah,
Like the loop is happening and everything else is repeating, but he has to go through life day by day. He still has to figure out the same things we all got to figure out.
yeah, and I think great art is generally like a mirror. You
Mm-hmm.
you
Yes.
get out of it what you put into it, and
Yeah.
you can see yourself in the movie or the story or TV show or artwork, whatever it is.
Which is why this movie is still so well known and popular. I mean, even with when I teach like high school students, I'm like, who's heard of that? And I still get a few hands. I'm like, okay, good. The rest of you go watch it.
Yeah, there's a reason why I feel like, a large number of time loop movies made after 2000 references Groundhog Day at some
Mm-hmm.
point.
Yep. You have to. You got to acknowledge it. Or you got to acknowledge the Star Trek The Next Generation episode.
Yeah.
Because they're the ones that all the nerds in the 90s knew.
I know you mentioned that you don't always like to put numbers on it, but
Right.
that is something that I have been asking everybody, and in two different chunks. But first off, like at the beginning, like where Phil is at this loop, if you did have to put a number on it, how long do you think that he's been uh, in Groundhog Day as of right now?
I think there is, if you want to really get into it, there's stuff we haven't seen. He could have met these people and hung out with them on the days of where he was trying to have date night with Rita. So all of this, he could have met all these people then. But we missed multiple deaths. So that's definitely, I think it's 4 different deaths that we can't fit to what he says.
Hmm.
And so there's at least 4 other days. I assume one of my problems with when people put days on it is we don't know what Phil's capable of at the beginning of the film.
Right.
We don't know if he knows any French. Not that he learns any French in the film. He quotes a Belgian song. But we don't know whether he actually knew how to play the piano at some point. I mean, a lot of people take piano lessons when they're a kid. If you haven't played even in decades, it's probably easier to pick it up again if you learned it once before. And a lot of this stuff could come from what he could do. He might also be good with the piano because he's good, like as we've said, his memory is great, which the movie tells us on day 2 or loop 2, because he recognizes that radio program immediately and he quotes it. Like the movie is letting us know this is a guy who's paying attention to what's around him. So a lot of this, even finding out about, we saw him ask stuff about Nancy, but finding out about Alice or any of these other people in the diner could have happened whenever. So I think what matters more is is the rest of the film after this, I think, is where there's room for a lot of extra days. Because you asked me before we were recording, maybe you're going to get to this question about the old man, where we only see him try to save him like twice. But the impression in the film is that is a huge moment in the film. And it matters to us in the audience when we feel bad. And it was weirdly funny when I saw this movie in Woodstock, because there was a kid in the audience that clearly had never seen the film. And when Phil calls the guy dad, he's like, wait, that's his dad? And the kid got so upset. And I was like, no, it's not his dad. But it made it personal. And for that kid and for people in the audience, like it matters that Phil calls him that. I don't know why Phil calls him that exactly, but it matters that he does. And so I think when it comes down to the day count, what matters is the rest of it. Because I don't want to think about how long he was depressed and killing himself. I don't want to imagine that he was taking advantage, even though I did blog entries entirely about this. I don't want to imagine that he went out and had sex with as many women in the town as he could. And in the musical of Groundhog Day, he mentions that he had sex with all the women from age 18 to 80. I think it's 18 to 83 is the line, and one dude when he was bored. And that's fine if he does all that, but I don't want to think about that, because that's almost worse than the depression part, because it's empty. Him going out with Nancy is funny because it's singular. Him going out with Lorraine and they're dressed up in costumes is funny because it's singular. If we start putting like people that are like, he's in there for 40 years, I'm like, that's depressing. He's in there for 10,000 years. That's even worse. That means when the loop is over, he won't be able to live. Normal life will suck. He won't know what happens. He won't be able to interact with people properly anymore. And I don't want that. I want a happy ending.
Yeah.
In a good time loop movie, it doesn't matter, because that linear journey is what matters.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. Personally, I tend to be more of a statistics-oriented type of person in at least certain areas. So I won't do it now, but I will, be going through all the statistics that I've collected and, my analysis of how long I feel like he spent during each of these sections.
Yeah.
Which in, like, just loosely, I'll say that, I think most days that we see after the first few, I think for about each day we see, there's probably anywhere between 5 and 30 days that we don't see.
Yeah, maybe. Some of them, I don't even remember the name now. One of the people that had a popular, I think it was a YouTube video about it, so everyone always quoted their number, put like his little bank robbery as something that would take like 2 weeks to prep. And I'm like, no, the movie has told us he has a really good memory. It would take him like a day where he probably got hit by that car and was in pain all day. He didn't get killed, or we'd know that because it would affect the overall story. But I assume that took some trial and error, but it didn't take weeks. He's good at this. It's an important thing for his character. Because as you said, his memory is what he can keep with him.
Yeah, and he's also, especially during the first half of the movie, he likes to take shortcuts rather than, go through the whole entire process.
Yep.
Because we see that with Nancy, rather than, actually getting to know Nancy and building a relationship that way. He just takes the shortcut of pretending like they knew each other in high school.
Mm-hmm. Well, but even that shortcut, coming up with those 3 questions to ask her, he probably thought about that all day. He's probably looking around, being like, okay, who am I going to talk to and what am I going to say? And that takes effort because he's smart. He knows things. This isn't some like idiot who can barely get along and then gets stuck in a loop. That wouldn't be as fun a movie. Actually, I've seen some like that.
And then there was one other thing that I wanted to ask you. I realized that I skipped this in my notes,
Okay.
but I think it is I am curious about because I feel like he's repeated this day several times. He feels very rehearsed at times. But what do you think it is about this day that makes Phil decide to move on?
I think it's the second half of this day. I think if he rehearsed any of this, it's the diner.
Hmm. Yeah, I especially think that the diner, because he never looks at his watch, but he
Yeah.
still knows in 5 seconds. And I feel
Right.
like that because of that timing, like he knows how the conversation has gone, and
Hmm.
he's timing it based on the beats of the conversation that he's already gone through.
And he knows where there's an empty booth. And so as they're talking to people, he's walking toward that booth so they can sit down for the end of the conversation. But once they're at that conversation, I think this is the only time it happens. Because I think maybe it's the music, maybe it's just the writing, and especially when she falls asleep and he has his little monologue, it feels genuine. And we don't expect genuine from him. He's always genuine, but his sort of genuine is not nice.
Mhm.
And so we don't expect it. And so I feel like the rest of this day is the only time this has ever happened. And he hasn't had that in a while. Whether it's 4 weeks, like I say at the minimum count, or whether it's already been a year. It's new, doing something unique. And especially doing it with Rita, where she knew what was happening and stayed with him.
Yep.
And so it changes it.
Personally, I'm very close to your thoughts. I do think that it's something that happens whenever they're in the room together that's new. But I do
Mm-hmm.
think that he has gotten her into the room before,
Oh, certainly.
like in this way, like in
I don't think on this day he has.
because
Because,
personally, I mean, there's certain moments like the way that she expects him, one of them, to disappear at midnight.
mm-hmm,
I think if you look at the way that he reacts to that and what he says afterwards, I feel like that is again, that's kind of a rehearsed
could be, yeah.
thing. But I think personally, I think it boils down to one moment and one line. And you did mention it, like the whenever he's talking to her while she's asleep.
Yeah.
And I think especially one specific line is whenever he says, "I don't deserve someone like you."
Right.
And I think that line specifically is his own impetus to think to himself, well, how can I deserve her?
Well, yeah, the rest of that line is, but if I ever could. It's like, this is the moment where he's wondering, maybe, like, what do I do that I'd be someone who could deserve someone good? Or anyone, for that matter.
Right. And personally, I think that moment right there, I think that he's, gotten to that point in general, but he's never had that specific moment
Yeah.
before today, and that is what causes him to change tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then tomorrow he changes the morning so much that this day's never going to happen like this again.
Yeah.
Because now he's got new things to do. And he knows what those things are already because he's been in this town for a while. He knows who gets hurt. He knows it's once he's with the old man that he sees the kid in the hospital, but like he knows what's going to happen. He knows the old ladies are there. He's seen all this stuff before. He's probably, I imagine he's been to the banquet a few times, that he's ended up there and been really cynical about it and hated it the whole time until now.
Yeah.
Of course, then I wonder if Buster always died when he choked on his food, which would have made the banquet very somber.
Yeah, I can I can imagine that.
I guess maybe someone else saved him initially, but then Phil jumped in to do it earlier.
Or he just, just passed out but didn't die.
It's also one of those things you're not supposed to think about, like the fact there's a train that comes through town. There's a train station out the window when he's on the phone at the gas station. Like, he could get out of town if he wanted to, and then people were like, well, why doesn't he leave town? Like, he does in the script, but those were pointless parts of the script.
Yeah, and I think that's it's interesting, and that reminds me of the other question that I've been asking everybody, because um, I've been asking people, there is a lot of days that we don't see,
Hmm.
and if there was a day that you think Phil had to have had that you would have liked to have seen, kind of like a deleted scene, and so far, several people have said that they wanted to see like a montage of him trying to leave the town.
That would be interesting early on, yeah.
But as far as you, what would you say would be?
My impulse when you said that question was it had actually to do with the French stuff because of Rita. I would love to see the moment where he's actually trying to learn French. And then just like later we see him in the diner and music's on, like then he hears the Belgian song. He's like, nah, screw French. I'm just going to quote that and see what happens. Because it doesn't matter if it goes badly. If it goes badly, he can just try again. But he's certainly going to take, as you said, the easy way first.
Yeah, and I mentioned that on the date too. Whenever he has like
Mm-hmm.
the books of French poetry,
Yeah.
and Sean was
Some
the guest at the
Baudelaire.
time, and he's like, "Well, do you think that he learned French so that he could read the French poetry?" And
Nope.
my
Doesn't
answer
need
to
to.
that was, "No, he wouldn't learn French until he absolutely need to. He would just fake it
Exactly.
until he felt like, well, maybe I do need to learn at least a little bit of French."
Yeah. The best like that, the best evidence that he doesn't learn French in the movie is that she says, "Oh, you speak French," because all that matters is her response.
Yeah,
She didn't demand more. She didn't be like, "Oh, keep going,"
and all
and then
he
he has to
says
keep
is "oui," which is the one French word that everybody knows.
right.
All right, well, that's about the end of my notes, unless there was anything else that you had that you wanted to say about this specific loop.
I'm trying to think because the beginning of this loop is the moment I talked about when I was on Groundhog Minute. And so I'm like looking at my notes for that. I'm like, what didn't I get to say there? And there's so much, but then I'm also going to have my own show related to this. And so I don't know what needs to be said now. I think what matters, and it's come up several times, is I don't think it matters if you count the days. I don't think it necessarily matters where specific loops begin or end. But what matters is what is Phil getting out of them. And I think this one gives him a genuine experience with another person. It doesn't matter even that it's Rita. It's Rita because a movie needs to have very few characters we spend a lot of time with. But it matters that he has a genuine experience with her and then feels better because he's gotten past the depression. But until this loop ends, he isn't doing anything else yet. And that until he decides to be better, which is what comes next, he just would have dropped back into that same loop again because, I mean, depression doesn't just go away.
Mm-hmm.
He's probably prone to it. He's a miserable guy who works at a news station. He's got a great job, but he is the worst about it. He thinks he's too good for it. And that's not going to make him happy in his day-to-day life.
Yeah, exactly. I have brought up that I feel like Phil at the beginning of the movie had a lot of self-loathing.
Yes. And my old sentiment in my blog, and I was so happy when I came up with it, and then I kept saying it throughout, is that Phil isn't trapped in a time loop in Punxsutawney. Phil was trapped in his life in Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
And so the whole point of the movie is he's not trapped anymore. He just has to figure that out. And this day is when that starts to happen. So that's why I requested this loop.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to thank you for joining me. I feel like it was a great discussion. I'm glad to hear your thoughts on this as as more or less like a Groundhog Day expert.
People have emailed me out of nowhere to ask me questions about this movie. So yeah.
But as far as I know that you've got your hand in a lot of projects, so I'm gonna give the floor to you. Whatever projects you'd like to plug or promote, go ahead and let everybody else know where they can find your work online.
Well, you can find links to all of this stuff at lemmingdrops.com, or if you want to go straight to the blog, you can go groundhogdayproject.com. But as far as projects upcoming as we record this, I don't know how upcoming once this goes out because I haven't set a start date yet. I will also be covering Groundhog Day, but minute by minute, along with 2 other movies. I'm doing a sort of tied together trilogy I have invented of Ex Machina, Groundhog Day, and Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, and I will be connecting those episodes together, sort of. So like minute 1 of each one, I might have the same guest or talk about the same themes or try to. And so I will definitely have to have you as a guest, by the way.
Oh, sure.
Once you're dealing with time loops and everything, and I will be dealing with like a different time loop each week of Groundhog Day Project minute by minute. I will have a time loop of the week where I talk about other movies and TV shows because there are, surprisingly, my list is too many to talk about if I do one per episode, which means I can leave off the really stupid ones. And that's great. But I can talk about some of my favorites, like, Repeaters is one that a lot of people haven't seen. I love that one. About drug addicts that get stuck in a time loop together. Oh, so good. But if you go to lemmingdrops.com, you find links to those shows. They will be starting, I don't know when this is going up, but they will be starting sometime in September, October of this year, 2021. Pilots will be up soon, and I'll know when that's happening later. But that's the thing to promote right now for me, because all my other shows are done. I have done a lot of them, but they're all linked on the website, lemmingdrops.com.
All right, and yeah, I'm looking forward to experiencing new time loops. I've seen a lot of time loop movies myself, but there's a lot that I haven't, and I will definitely be referring back to your IMDb time loop list whenever I'm making the decision for future seasons of this show.
Nice.
So I'll be referring to that a lot, and I'm glad that exists for me to use as a resource.
And if you ever find any that are on there, let me know. I will add them.
Of course. And as always, I am Bubbawheat, and you can find me at flightstitesandmovienights.com. You can find me on Twitter at Bubbawheat, and you can find this show, It's Time to Rewind, at Anchor.fm, as well as anywhere else where you listen to podcasts. You can also join our Facebook group, It's Time to Rewind, a time loop group where you can discuss the episodes as they come out, or just any time loop movies, time loop TV shows, just bringing just about any sort of discussion there that you'd like. I'd like to see that continue to grow. Yeah, I did it again. I'm still struggling to find a way to end the show, and hopefully, like I've said before, I'll have a better way other than I'll see you on the next loop.
I'm a god. Well, what if there is no tomorrow? I'm a god. There wasn't one today.
I don't deserve someone like you. But if I ever could, I swear I would love you for the rest of my life.
I was actually surprised that you said 27 at the beginning of this, because I figured you'd have a longer count than me. I mean, I know you're doing it by episode and you wouldn't add episodes for the stuff we don't see, but my minimal count, this is 28.
It is day 28.
And,
I just I copied and pasted, and I did not correct myself.
Oh,
I did not change that number.
Fix it in post.
Yeah,
But
exactly.